Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
A week today, a big demonstration in London will take place. Stand up against racism and fascism. No to scapegoating immigrants. No to Islamophobia. No to anti-Semitism. Co-organisers of the event are Unite Against Fascism, a broadly based campaign which in dark days and fine have kept the flame of such ideals alive.
The march will take place through a backdrop of mass unemployment amongst ethnic minority youth in Britain, a deluge of scaremongering in the gutter media, and a Dutch auction amongst political parties as to who can be meanest and most menacing towards minority communities. As election fever mounts, so do the fears of Britain's beleaguered minorities.
Joining us now is a stalwart of anti-fascism in Britain, Sabby Dhalu. Sabby, thanks for coming on the Sputnik. We'll talk about the demonstration in a few minutes, but the airwaves are becoming clogged up with race stories. More usually than not, anti-Muslim stories, but in this week, Nigel Farage's extraordinary foray into demanding the repeal of race discrimination laws in the British workplace. This is part of the backdrop to your demonstration, isn't it?
Of course. I mean, Farage's recent outburst is not borne out by the facts at all. I mean, one of the problems we've had is since the coalition government came to power in 2010 is the abolition of monitoring the impact of legislation on minority communities and women. So equality impact assessments have been abolished. So it's impossible to actually ascertain proper figures of how austerity and other government measures have impacted on women, minority communities, people with disabilities, and so on. And so therefore...
Proper figures might be thin on the ground, but any fool knoweth that the claim that Farage has made that racism in the workplace is a thing of the past, that Britain has moved on. You're a minority ethnic and a woman.
That's right.
What do you say to that?
Well, my experience is the exact opposite. I've actually found, over the last 5 years, certainly, in the context of austerity, a rise in racism. I see people making funny comments, racist comments on buses, on public transport and things like that. Things I thought were a thing of the past and I've actually not experienced since I was a child growing up in the late 1980s. So certainly racism has been on the increase, but also there were figures released, I think by the Labour Party yesterday, saying that unemployment amongst BME communities has actually increased by 50%.
50, yeah.
So the idea that racism in the workplace is a thing of the past. For that reason, BME communities in the police force. So I think that it is just not every... OK, there aren't equality impact assessment, but every other statistic and fact shows that racism is alive and kicking on the rise.
He's not, of course, a fascist, Nigel Farage, neither are UKIP, but there are fascists in Britain menacing minority communities. Let's run across the horizon on that. My assessment is that street racism, in the form of, for example, the EDL, has begun to dissipate. The recent failure of the German import Pegida at their demonstration in Newcastle was just that, a real damp squib, outnumbered 10, 15 to 1 by overwhelmingly non-Muslim, non-minority ethnic white people from Newcastle. Is that your assessment? Are these people more a danger as lone wolves than any kind of mass movement?
I think, yes, it is correct that the English Defence League and other similar movements like Pegida, as you mentioned, the attempt to set up a British version of Pegida, is certainly dissipating in Britain. And I think that is because organisations like ourselves, Unite Against Fascism, have actually spoke out against the English Defence League and argued consistently, despite opposition, saying that we must mobilise against them. When they mobilise on the streets, it's important for anti-fascists, for anti-racists to mobilise against them. And I think we were right, and I think that did actually defeat them. That demoralised them, we out-mobilised them, and we won that argument because some people thought that it was causing trouble and it was best to stay at home when they come to town. But I think had we done that, I think the EDL would have snowballed into a much bigger street movement. Because there's a clear relationship between out-mobilising them, particularly in Tower Hamlets in 2011, when there's a really big demonstration opposing the EDL there, out-mobilising them and getting broad support for our demonstrations. It really did have a knock-on effect on their morale and their ability to mobilise.
Well, I have no doubt of the correctness of your line and the heroism of your work. But it's also the case, isn't it, that there has never been, even in the 30s, a mass appetite for fascism. It speaks to the good sense of the great majority of the British public, don't you think?
I agree, yes. I don't think it really stands in the British tradition, but I think it's important for people to speak out against them and mobilise against them, because I think the danger is that one becomes complacent and thinks that, you know, this isn't in the British tradition, so we don't really need to worry about it. I think had we not spoken out and stood up against them, I think that they could have become a bigger force, because we've seen across Europe there's a different story. We've seen Pegida, albeit, you know, they've been out-mobilised by the anti-racists and anti-fascists in Germany, but to get that size demonstrations, you know, 10,000, 20,000, that sort of level on the streets is a worrying development.
Absolutely. We nonetheless have an ongoing problem, partly below the radar. We've got police guarding synagogues, quite rightly, because the danger of anti-Semitic attacks there are clear and present. We don't have police outside mosques. Admittedly, the Muslim population is more than 10 times larger than the Jewish population, but nonetheless, there are ongoing attacks against Muslim property and against individual Muslims, usually by one or two lone wolves. How big a danger is all that?
I think it's a very big danger, particularly after the Islamophobic response we've seen post the Paris attacks and the Copenhagen attacks. We have seen hashtag #KillAllMuslims trend on Twitter. We've seen Rupert Murdoch making interventions such as all Muslims are all responsible for this and should be held responsible for these attacks. We saw a complete media silence, the complete opposite response to the Chapel Hill shootings in North Carolina, where 3 Muslim students were shot dead. It wasn't even covered in the mass media, despite the fact that it trended on social media. And we don't see an attempt by people to hold all white people across the globe responsible for the actions of the gunman or the terrorists that killed the 3 Muslim students. The thought of it is ludicrous, holding all white people responsible for that shooting. But this is what happens to the Muslim community. Over 1 billion people across the globe are made to feel responsible for the actions of a handful of terrorists. This is despite condemnation widespread across the globe by Muslim people against these attacks. And we have seen, as you quite rightly point out, attacks on mosques and attacks on individual Muslims, and perhaps more worryingly so, attacks on Muslim women wearing the hijab. We see a lot of, I think around 50% of, or more than 50% of attacks on Muslims are actually on Muslim women. And I think that's quite horrific for Muslim women to be facing violent attacks, violent racist attacks, but also sexist, because the perpetrators are mostly men. So this is very worrying, and you're right that the state response isn't the same as attacks on Jewish communities and anti-Semitism. I mean, quite rightly, there are police guarding synagogues.
Indeed, it should be the same.
Yes, that's right.
Should be the same.
Why aren't mosques and Muslim community organisations treated in the same fashion? This is what we need. And I think you're right. I think that the English Defence League and attempts by groups like Pegida here in Britain to try and form themselves here will use not just the attacks in Paris and Copenhagen, but the Islamophobic response by the state and the media and politicians to try and grow. So it is very important that we don't become complacent, and wherever they rear their ugly head, that we mobilise against them.
Tell us about the demonstration a week today.
Well, precisely because of the rise in Islamophobia, the rise in anti-Muslim hate crime, opposing Islamophobia and standing up against this hatred is a central part of the demonstration, and we've received a very positive response by Muslim communities across the country who are saying they're mobilising and coming along to the demonstration, so that's very good. It's formally supported by the Muslim Council of Britain along with a range of other Muslim organisations, so that will all be a key part of the demonstration, as will opposing anti-Semitism. I think it's very important to show unity. Unity.
It's the other side of the coin, as you say, Gayatri. It's a real and present danger.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the experience of Muslim communities at the moment is almost identical to the experience of Jewish communities in the early 20th century and in the 1930s. The cartoons that we see depicting the Prophet Muhammad are almost identical to the cartoons that one saw attacking the Jewish communities over 100 years ago. So I think it's very important that we show unity against this form of hatred and unite the Muslim and Jewish communities who have both historically been attacked by fascists and racists. That's right. Yeah, that's another thing.
Where is it from and to, times, etc.?
We're assembling at 12 noon on Saturday, the 21st of March, outside BBC Portland Place, and we'll be marching to Trafalgar Square.
And I'm one of the speakers.
You absolutely are. We'll be very looking forward to seeing you.
You have a galère of orators. Well, I wish you the very best for the demonstration next Saturday. But also take my metaphorical hat off to all the work that Unite Against Fascism has been doing. You really are heroes. Sabby Dhalu.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that.
Coming up after the break, the father of all batsmen, Matt O'Connor of Fathers for Justice. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Matt and Nadine O'Connor are the public faces of one of the biggest civil rights campaigns in Britain, Fathers for Justice. Not that you'd know it if you followed only the so-called mainstream media, still less if you were stuck inside the Westminster bubble. Politicians run scared of the idea that a child is entitled to both parents in their lives, prisoners of the mother is always right mentality.
But mothers are not always right. Sometimes they're wrong, and even willfully so, playing out their anger, justified or otherwise, towards the father, irrespective of the impact on the children's well-being.
Feckless fathers abound in Britain, men who walk out on their children again and again. But millions of fathers are desperate to be closely involved in their children's lives and are precluded by the family courts system from doing so. It is a Gordian knot. Trying to unravel it is Matt O'Connor, and he joins us now. Matt, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. Before we move on more specifically to your field, it's not tangential, I would argue, the extraordinary decision of the Supreme Court this week to allow a woman, more than 20 years after their divorce, to file a claim for a financial settlement against the man they finally divorced more than 2 decades ago. Or do you think it is tangential?
Well, it is. It's absolutely wrapped up in a whole approach that the legal system takes to men and to fathers, which is effectively, George, is to reduce us to the status of cash points. It's like going out on a Saturday night and putting your card into a machine and the cash just keeps coming. I mean, it's a dream scenario. But it reflects badly, I think, this judgment on the British justice system. it's an outrageous judgment, even by their own pitifully low standards. It basically says that this guy is a cash point, not just when he was married, but a cash point for life. And this is a woman who is a grown woman, clearly can look after herself, clearly can be responsible for herself, clearly can provide for herself. She has no dependencies. So this is a very serious and worrying judgment. I think a lot of men will be running scared now and very, very concerned that this basically opens up some serious doors and to potential future claims.
It's a slight infantilization of women, isn't it? The idea that in the 21st century, for decades after the marriage has ended, that somehow they're dependent upon a man and
women to the status of victims and to status of being dependents. And I think the idea behind feminism that women would be empowered to stand on their own 2 feet, to be responsible for their actions. And I think this idea somehow that isn't the case is fundamentally wrong. And I think we need to really step back from the issues and look at the whole issue and say, why is it that fathers are still seen in law as being cash points?
Well, let's turn to that subject. I have become grimly familiar with this system, and I represent many people. One just last Saturday, for example, came in to see me, showed me all the paperwork, that the child maintenance service has been taking a very substantial amount of money from him every month, against which there's no meaningful appeal. The figures are laid down, there's no flexibility, and so on. But the key point is that he has not seen the child in question for 7 years, despite courts regularly saying he ought to have access to the child. The mother has simply refused, and there seems to be no meaningful mechanism by which his rights, I'll come back to that point, his rights or the child's right to see him can be respected.
Yeah, and this is not an unusual case. This is common stuff. Yeah, I've got a friend of mine whose daughter was taken out of the jurisdiction to Scotland. He's a train driver. He's paid, I think, somewhere in the region of £45,000–50,000 over the last 10 years. The girl's now 14. And it's an outrage. I've got another friend of mine who has spent over £50,000 trying to see his daughter, to get court orders are enforced. The CSA comes along, cleaned out his bank account, taken his money, threatened to take his passport, took his driving licence. They have quasi-judicial powers, the CSA, or the Child Maintenance Service, as they now call it. And these are really serious issues that if the coin was flipped and reversed, and this was happening to mothers, there would be a national outcry about it. And that's our point about this, is the gender apartheid that applies to people like me because they say we're white, we're male, that somehow we're at the top of the tree. Whereas in reality, as the author Warren Farrell said, there is a glass cellar where men are kept. Because if you look at it, we have... suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 45. We're more likely to be homeless, more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be subject to violence, more likely to be incarcerated, and more likely to be murdered. On many, many, many levels, men and the issues related to men and men's health just really aren't paid any due serious attention by our political classes.
It is indeed ironic. Let me, though, go back to a dichotomy I glanced at in my last question. It is the fundamental principle of the Children's Act that it's the children that has rights, not the parents. The problem with that is that arrogates or derogates to someone else, namely a judge in a secret court, because this is not open to the public. One may not discuss in public any of these cases. It derogates to a judge the right to decide what the children's interest is. Now, I actually question that in principle. I'm a father, by the grace of God, many times over. I have rights, in my view, to see my children. Whether a judge thinks children have an interest or a case for seeing me. What's your take on that?
My take on it is very, very simple. There's a small thing called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that enshrines everybody's right to family life. That's our starting point. That's what everybody signed up to. Yes, of course a child has rights, but to say that fathers have no rights is an outrage. And as you rightly say, we have an unelected, unaccountable, unsackable judiciary operating in complete secrecy that determines what the best interest of a child is. Now, the thing is about this best interest of a child argument is a wicked, wicked deceit that lies at the heart of a rotten and corrupt family justice system. And I'll tell you why. Because nobody has kept any records on the outcomes for children who've been through the family justice system. This is not based on evidence. This is based on what the judge thinks the child's best interest is. And as we've seen, with 4 million fatherless children in this country now, with all the social consequences that flow from that, the family courts are fundamentally abusive and out of control. And it's just like legalised cage fighting. And we need to have a proper review and inquiry into their operation.
Matt, since we last interviewed you, they cut down the legal aid in family court. It must have had a tremendous effect on fathers and the children. Yeah,
it's had perhaps less of an effect on fathers because many fathers didn't qualify for legal aid. But what it has done is reduce the family courts to legalise cage fighting, where most of the people going into the system are not legally represented. And so you're literally pitching parent against parent. To prove who the best parent is, you have to prove who the worst is. And I always say, courts are for criminals, not families. This is not a place for any family to be judged, let alone by a 70 or 80-year-old judge who's got a public school boy from Eton clicking his false teeth, as I've seen them do regularly in courts, operating in secrecy. And I think we need a complete review of the family justice system so we have a proper, accountable, fair and balanced system of family justice supported by a presumption, what I believe, what I campaign for, a presumption of 50-50 shared parenting. So we have equality, proper quality for the system. Somebody says to me, well, why would you start with 50-50? Equality is like pregnancy. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You either have it or you don't.
Yeah, you should start from that presumption. There are many cases in which that 50-50 would be altered.
Of course.
But the presumption should be 50-50. By the way, the cuts in legal aid issue is worse, if I may say so, than you stated, because the one criterion that you still can get legal aid is if you allege that there has been domestic violence. And mothers who claim there was domestic violence get legal aid. So you have a situation where my constituents, sometimes inarticulate, sometimes undereducated, certainly underqualified, are up against qualified and polished barristers who are being paid for by the state, but the father is there left to his own devices. How unfair is that?
Yeah, but it was always the case to some extent. It was always the case where a mother would qualify for legal aid if you tick the box that says there's been abuse. Now, the thing is, with the domestic violence lobby, abuse these days can constitute financial abuse, which is dispute over credit cards, emotional abuse, arguing in the car about where you're going on the map, you know, arguing, discussions like that. So it's not just relates to violence, but also every father is now risk assessed. So CAFCAS, the Court Welfare Service, collect soft evidence, which is arguments in the household between mother and father, and hard evidence, which is if there's been police reports or complaints to the police. But every father is risk assessed because they say where it is safe to do so. Contact can take place where it's safe to do so. So the presumption, George, is that you and me are inherently dangerous to our children. And that assumption doesn't apply to mother. It doesn't apply to mother's new boyfriend. It is grotesquely unfair and prejudicial based solely on our gender.
Don't get me started on CAFCAS. Matt O'Connor, Fathers for Justice. I salute you.
Pleasure.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, in response to Nigel Farage's outrageous comments on racial discrimination in the working place, Marcia Brown responses, just another hairball policy belched out to satisfy the knuckle draggers. When I put out the article about the woman getting the
right to sue on the divorce.
Yes, by the Supreme Court. Lots of responses. Most of them agree that it's not really fair. Both men and women, by the way. Craig Hill says, after 20 years since he remarried, it's going to be an open season for any woman to take ex-husbands to courts wanting payouts. And that's all that we've got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show and almost the end of the Sputnik. Join us next week for the very last orbit.
Why? Stay in touch with us on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, or Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.